have a few questions on the whole reform process that my two fellow speakers didn't really address. It's all very nice, and I'm, even though I'm British, I'm a big fan of Ukraine joining the EU, although I have to be honest and say it's the first time I've ever heard that the EU has a national anthem as well. And I don't know the words of the EU national anthem. But on the question of reforms
it's
and the
Ode
EU,
to Joy.
Firstly, the EU is not currently offering Ukraine membership. Let's remember that. It never has. With the war and the conflict with Russia and everything else, the opposition from countries like Germany, France, and maybe Italy and Greece is going to be probably even higher. That's one problem. Secondly, I think none of my fellow speakers really didn't talk about the problem that Russia is determined to prevent Ukraine going west. I didn't get a sense of urgency from the speakers, my fellow speakers, that the current Russian leadership is basically seeking to destroy Ukraine as an independent state. And it wants regime change in Kiev, it wants a federalized Ukraine with Donbass having veto, and it wants an end to EU and NATO membership. And there are voices in the West, in both North America and in Western Europe, who think Ukraine should go down that path. But nevertheless, how can you implement reforms if you have this ongoing proxy war that Russia is undertaking, which is eating up a huge amount of your budget and such like? On the question of whether we should be optimistic about reforms or not, I'm a bit more sanguine, sorry. I'd be surprised if many of the reforms that have been undertaken since Euromaidan would have been undertaken if Ukraine was not bankrupt, and financially it is a bankrupt country. So in other words, the reforms have been undertaken purely because of pressure from the West, which is saying, here's the money, but do the reforms. And that, I think, is obvious from the way that Parliament does them at the last minute, only because it requires the money from the West. On the question of young people, which comes up all the time at these conferences, I would kind of question the fact that somehow all young people were pro-Euromaidan. I see a lot of young people amongst the separatist ranks. They're young people as well. And there were quite a few young people amongst the vigilantes. Olis Doni, who was the deputy mayor of Kiev under the very maverick Chernovetsky, has just been elected to the Ukrainian parliament, even though he should be sitting in jail. But more importantly, and this is maybe, I haven't heard the paper by Marta Dechok on the media, but more importantly, far more young people in Ukraine are tied in with Russian social media projects and internet than with Western ones. And we should remember that. VKontakte, which is the Eurasian equivalent of Facebook, and which is controlled by Putin's people from January of this year, has 6 times more members in Ukraine than Facebook has. Remember that. Yandex, which is a Russian search engine, is far more used, including by the Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of Defense, by the way, and the government, than Google or Yahoo. And you will get many Ukrainians who still continue to use the free email address .ru as opposed to Google or Hotmail or Yahoo. So, although, yes, I mean, everything that I've heard is there, what we need to see is that there's another side to Ukraine, and to, as it were, de-Sovietize and remove that cultural influence is a massive project, which we should realize is still there, and it's there not just amongst the older generation, it's there amongst young people as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks.
Thank you, Taras, for those comments. I think in my own presentation that I didn't really want to overstate the case about the difficulties and challenges ahead. There are enormous challenges, and I think that in some respects that there is tremendous disillusionment and despair as a result of the insurmountable sort of difficulties that the Ukrainian country or Ukrainian nation has faced. But that being said, I think that the emphasis needs to be on sort of the will of the people who in effect have experienced great hardship. They've experienced in many ways uncertainty, insecurity, and the like. And so all of this has to be put in that particular context. It isn't a question about sort of what Europe will do or not do, or what Russia will do or not do. The question, I think, is central to the political project ahead, which is what can I do? Or how might I retain an element of dignity in the context of all of this, the crisis and the difficulties that I'm encountering. So the emphasis should be on the individual, not necessarily about what's going on around us. The day will come where the European Union may or may not sort of agree to Ukrainian accession. But at the end of the day, in terms of Ukrainians fighting for a political future, if you will, that will be harder ultimately to deny Ukrainians once that's achieved. Let me say again, I don't want to minimize the difficulties, sort of the legacy of post-Soviet culture, or Soviet culture, post-Soviet culture, the criminality, the lawlessness in Donbass and Crimea, the minority rights abuses, the human rights abuses. These are, there's a catalog of these things. But the question ultimately from the perspective of the Ukrainian government at this point is that it has no alternative but going forward, and that going forward ultimately is depending very much on the kinds of initiatives and strengths that sort of located in the Maidan itself. And that's possibly because there is no other alternative. There is no other alternative, and I believe that we can sort of throw up our hands and say, well, the challenges are insurmountable. But at the same time, I think we also need to sort of address some of the other things, not least of which is that these reforms that have been undertaken, there have been sort of piecemeal reforms. They tend to be ad hoc, and there also is opposition, and there are individuals and critics who sort of talk about, why are we doing this in the case of the conflict in the East that necessarily discredits and undermines the government per se. I think, nevertheless, we see a sort of a wave of these things, a tendency, a trend that we could take some comfort in knowing that all of this would not have been possible. All of this would not have been possible a year ago. Mm-hmm. But now we're at a sort of a cusp where, in effect, there's yet more to come.
Well, this is on, yeah. Very briefly, I'll respond first of all to Taras, and I'll try to throw out a couple of questions as well. The thing that Taras said at the end with respect to EU not possible and Russia's goals, etc. I don't think anybody has any illusions in Ukraine in the new political elite as to the fact that this is supposedly, Ukraine will be part of the European Union. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the people that I meet with regularly within the Ukrainian government are actually Eurosceptics, as strange as that may sound. The statement is, we're not being asked into the European Union. And quite frankly, even if we were asked into the European Union, it is questionable whether we'd want to go into there. And this is one of the aspects of the second issue in the revolution that I'm talking about is the European Union is effectively a social democratic kind of entity. And the liberal/libertarian/bourgeois ideology of the current political elite, the post-Maidan political elite, isn't particularly comfortable in that European Union. So I think, but at the same point, we need to realize that this is a moot point at this point because, excuse me, sorry for the tautology. The statement from the political elite would be, when we get to the standards of the European Union with respect to justice, with respect to court system, with respect to deregulation, with respect to rule of law, etc., then we will decide whether or not the European Union is for us. But right now, it's European standards rather than formal membership. with respect to the fact that the reforms were sparked, have been sparked by bankruptcy, well, Taras, I apologize, but the first legislative reform that was done post-Maidan, I'm kind of proud of this one, it was the reform of higher education. I'm one of the authors of the law. So it's kind of, of course, economic reforms are being done partially because of the fact that Ukraine is a bankrupt country. Absolutely correct. But to say that that is the only motivation, I think, is a little bit too simplistic. I do want to correct you. I'm sorry. It wasn't Oles Duny. Oles Duny is one of the leaders of the Student Maidan of 1990. It's Oles Dovhy. Rather important to make that distinction. With respect to Kontakti and Facebook, well, if you look at the demographic of the people that are in Kontakti, you're looking at kids that are 12 to 18 years old. It's a funny thing that happens as soon as you enter university, you switch to Facebook. And as far as Yandex is concerned, well, Yandex happens to provide maps of cities and, in other words, cave-based traffic. Unfortunately, Google and the other ones don't do that. So I think that the statistics are probably based on the fact that people are looking at traffic jams as opposed to people looking at using these things as search engines. Let me respond to what Bohdan said, and I think that that's actually the most important thing. Bohdan made a statement of, central to what happened at the Maidan is this ethic of what can I do? And I think that that's something that comes out of the Maidan very clearly. I've never heard so many people quoting John F. Kennedy as I've heard over the last year. And the translations are in Ukrainian or in Russian, etc. Hopefully you remember that don't ask what you can do for your country, ask what your country, sorry, the other way around. Don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I think that that's really the ethic of Maidan, and that's something that provides me with a lot of hope. If I may, very, very briefly, I'll ask a question to my other two colleagues, and that is, very briefly. Bohdan, you mentioned something about this is to some extent something that is taken very often as understood, samozrozumile, right?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Yeah, okay. I'll open it up. All right, this idea, then maybe somebody else can talk about this as well. This idea of civil society and Maidan being a civil society movement. I think that we need to really be careful with that term, because the civil society is something that I'm not sure Maidan was really a reflection of civil society as de Tocqueville, for example, would have called civil society or someone else. So I think civil society is something that needs to be explored a little bit further. And finally, with respect to, well, let me just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Can we open it up now to the audience? And I'd like to ask those who would like to participate in this to please limit your comments to, or try to ask a question and not comment. Roman?
I was interested, Taras Kuzio, in your comment about the way the Party of Regions elite integrated into the United Russia Party. And I note that, in part, I assume because Crimea is legally now part of the Russian Federation. Now in Donbass, Zakharchenko and others, like Donbass is not likely to be part of the Russian Federation. So are these military criminal leaders in the Donbass in some way going to be an inconvenience in the future for the Russian polity? I mean, what are their options if they cannot join the United Party in Russia?
Tarasa, did you get that?
Yeah. Just quickly on, I think I'll link up the issue of civil society to this question, because I think it's an important issue. Of course, and I've seen it traveling around eastern and southern Ukraine last year, civil society is doing an incredible, whatever you want to call it, I mean, civil society, for use of a better word, is doing an incredible job in providing food, medicines, even military equipment for the Ukrainian volunteer battalions, military, and National Guard. This is very positive, and it's obviously an afterflow from the Euromaidan and a reaction well, the crystallization of pro-Ukraine identity amongst Russian speakers in eastern southern Ukraine. At the same time, there's a negative side to this. The reason they're able to do this, on the whole, is because Ukraine, for the last 20 years, has had a pretty stable shadow economy, which is one of the highest in the world, at 50% of GDP. And I'm saying this being half Italian, where Italy has a very high one, at 25%. So Ukraine, you can do all of this because the government isn't doing it, because you have a very high shadow economy, and that's bad. That means that a huge amount of money that should be going to the state budget is not going to the state budget, and because the shadow economy is so stable over a long period of time, that means that there are interests in different parts of society in maintaining it relatively stable. Nobody's trying to reduce it down. Maybe they are today. On the question of reforms, well, to be quite frank, well, of course, it's very easy relatively easy to adopt legislation on higher education. It's far more difficult on economics, finance, and in particular rule of law and corruption. And I was really referring more to economics, finance, and rule of law, corruption, where I'm a bit more sanguine than Mikhailo. We have a situation, and there are many examples you can find on YouTube and elsewhere, where people join the volunteer battalions and have to raise $2,500, $3,000, which is a lot of money for Ukrainians, to buy everything they need. And I wonder whether many Brits or Canadians would spend their own money if their country was attacked to buy equipment for themselves. It's a reflection of this sort of bankruptcy, the fact that all Ukrainian presidents didn't invest in the military, and then it was even depleted even further under Yanukovych, for obvious reasons, for corruption, because he was working on behalf of Russia. On the question of on the Donbass, we have the irony that the Donbass separatists would love to join Russia, but Putin's telling them to stay put because he wants them to have a veto over Kiev's domestic and foreign policies. And of course, there's no federal country in the world where a province has control over, say, foreign and security policy. I mean, that simply doesn't exist in the real world. And in Ukraine, federalism in general is a dirty word, never mind the fact of giving Donbass this kind of veto. So how do we get around that major problem? But on the question of, and then linking this to civil society and views of Ukrainians about the Donbass, an interesting thing for the audience will be to hear that one of the most patriotic region of Ukraine, Western Ukraine, is actually the region where levels of people turning up who are called for conscription duty is actually one of the lowest. One of the highest rates are in eastern and southern Ukraine, because of course if you live in Dnipropetrovsk or Zaporizhia, you think that after Donbass you're next. And so there they have 100% take-up of people who are called up, who are joining the military and national. In Ukraine, they're having problems with recruitment. And an individual, an activist in Ivano-Frankivsk recently was, I believe, criminally charged for calling on potential conscripts to not actually turn up. And the reasons for that, I think, are very simple. Western Ukraine's a long way from Donbass. It is a really long way. I mean, by train, even on the fast train, we're talking 12 hours. 5 to Kiev and then 7 from Kiev to Donetsk. But many West Ukrainians, such as, for example, Yuri Andrukhovich, always thought Donbass wasn't really Ukrainian. So why should our sons, brothers, cousins die for a region which wants to be part of Russia anyway? So, all of these things are in the air. And if President Poroshenko, for example, was to propose a referendum at the same time as holding local elections in Donbass to decide which way you would like to go, towards Russia or towards the West with Ukraine, I bet there would be a lot of people in many parts of Ukraine who would say, to hell with this region, in particular in Western Ukraine. So, it's a very mixed picture, as it were. I think a lot of people in West Ukraine would say to the separatists, you want to go to Russia? get the hell out of here and leave us alone. But it's Putin actually who, and many people in the spring of 2014 in Donbass, when there was a lot of like hyper optimism, thought that the Donbass would be next after Crimea and be annexed by Russia. But it's Putin that's saying, no, we want the Donbass to stay in Ukraine. And he's using the same logic as Vladimir Lenin back in 1918. Because the reason why Lenin included the Donbass in Ukraine was because there was very little Bolshevik support inside Ukraine proper. So he attacked the Donbass, which is industry, which has Bolshevik support, as a way to increase support for his party. And the same reasons are there for Putin today. Thank you.
Okay. Lubomir Markevich wants to ask a question.
Thank you. I'd just like to begin by thanking all the speakers. I found each one of them very interesting in the way they approached the whole issue of the Maidan and the various perspectives they advocate in terms of how and what we may see in terms of what may be going forward. But I'd like to preface my question with a bit of a comment. I think all three of you gentlemen know that I've spent a lot of the time, the last 20 years in Ukraine. And it's only the last 2 months that I've spent here in Canada. And I found it very interesting that I see this sort of impression of the Maidan treated by Western world leaders, Western journalists, and even Western academia more or less in the same symmetrical framework. And the consensus appears to be that there really is only a political solution to this crisis going on in Ukraine. And I can certainly understand that from the type of values that we in the West have grown up in the societies that we come from, because basically we, as a fundamental sort of structure, believe that everything has to come through some kind of a constitutional order. But I don't completely agree that the sort of transition of the Maidan itself has been completely 100% consigned to the constitutional order of Ukraine, i.e. the election of a president, the election of a government, and certainly endorsing the EU reforms that are supposed to go forward. I see that too. I see that vector very, very strongly. But I would submit that there is also a parallel vector that is not explored because it doesn't fit within our own paradigm of how we view our own societies. And that paradigm is the transition of the Maidan also into the warring zone, where the Maidan has basically only transferred location from the Ploshcha square in downtown Kyiv to the regions in the Donbass where there is active fighting going on, and the active fighting, at least on the Ukrainian side, is being borne heavily by these volunteer battalions. Now, if you take the proposition that governments take their legitimacy from the people, then certainly the constitutional order is a very strong vector that everybody has to recognize. But that doesn't explain why there isn't any mass movement within Ukraine by the people, by the journalists, to disband these battalions and subsume them formally in all respects into the Ukrainian army, or completely disband them and just take their personnel over. In fact, it's almost as if the Ukrainians have a very deep understanding of their own history. They are hedging their bets. They see that the battalions are a natural extension of the Maidan. They also represent, in the same framework of what Mikhailo Vinitsky referred to at the end, where the dignity and the values of the person are both collective and individual. Because you see the battalion soldiers not abandoning their wounded, they're not abandoning their dead, but they're fighting collectively. And these are also projections of what the Maidan was all about. And I tend to think that the whole issue of what these battalions and this whole support massively that they are getting to this very day from the population at large is a phenomena that doesn't really fit our paradigm. And I'm curious why in the Western, and you can't speak for the journalists or the politicians, but at least in the academia, why there isn't an outreach into the intelligence communities, the military think tanks of Western countries, and introduce their analyses of what is going on into this discussion so that there's a plurality of views. Because at the present time, I only see the sort of political defeatism in terms of what we're seeing, in terms of surrendering Ukrainian territory piecemeal according to EU rules and everybody's comfort zone in Western valleys, because that's all we can tolerate. But there is this other dimension. I'm curious if you might want to comment on that. Sorry for the long preamble.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone want to tackle that first, or anyone have?
I can
Anything?
I can try it, but
Go
okay.
ahead.
My issue is that this is going to be not a short answer. Okay, let's do
Try
the
to keep
volunteer.
it-
Try to keep it short. All right, the volunteer battalions. The volunteer battalions and their the concept of extending the Maidan eastwards in terms of values, etc. Look, I think it's important to understand that we, unfortunately, in these 3 days of symposium, have not really had any military experts here. I have an opportunity to meet with some military experts, both in Kyiv and in Yavorivsky Polygon, which is Western Ukraine. And we know that there are a variety of people well, there's 300 advisors currently in Ukraine from a variety of different NATO countries. I think it's important to understand and I'm getting to an answer to your question, Dubko, but what is the training that is happening, right? It's easy to provide a Javelin missile system. A Javelin missile system destroys tanks. The problem is that a Javelin missile system destroys tanks, and it requires a particular kind of paradigm for a soldier to use a Javelin missile system. We are all aware in the West of this concept of the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement basically gives you a general framework, and when you are a soldier, if you're an officer, even a junior officer, in the field, you make your own decisions whether to fire that Javelin missile or not. That's not the way the Ukrainian army, which is basically an unreformed army from the Soviet days, works. If some of you remember the Korean Airlines disaster back in 1989, if I'm not mistaken, or 88, the pilot received his order to shoot from Moscow. In other words, it was a direct order. That's the way the Soviet Union functioned. The centralized order system went down the chain of command. And the Ukrainian army works in exactly the same way. Now, the Maidan was very different. And the volunteer battalions are very different. The volunteer battalions are sometimes criticized that they think too much before following orders. Well, in actual fact, what they're doing is they're acting in a very Western kind of military way, meaning nobody wants to be cannon fodder. In a Soviet military mentality, you must be cannon fodder. If you are ordered to go in and die for your country, you will die for your country. A volunteer battalion, and the Americans are great at this. It's not the greatest glory of a soldier is not to die for his country. It's to make the other guy die. And I think that's kind of that is a different kind of paradigm, which fits nicely into the Maidan paradigm. It fits very nicely into what the volunteer battalions are all about. And at the moment, I think one of the things that's happening, I very much agree with those, including, by the way, General Breedlove, who's actually come in and said that the volunteer battalions are likely going to become the basis for a new Ukrainian army. Not disbanding them, but in fact making them the basis of, and making them the root of the reform. I do want to say one thing about that Roman Patrician asked with respect to the Donbass in Ukraine. I think it's important for us to realize that Putin's whole concept of empire is a concept of Russia being surrounded by pockets of criminality. We look at the former Königsberg, now Kaliningrad. We look at the South Ossetia. We look at Transnistria, etc. In other words, this is a pattern, right? How do we get rid of our own criminals? Well, we give them spaces in which they can actually do what they need to do, and they pay us a percentage of the take. I mean, that's the way the Russian system currently works, and I think that's an important answer to why Putin doesn't really want the Donbass in Russia. He wants it in Ukraine, not just for geopolitical reasons, but also for reasons of his own expedience. My optimism with respect to the future of Ukraine comes from this idea of 3 levels of war. I tried to present this on my last slide, and I think it's important for us to understand. We are winning the war with respect to the national dimension. Even a Ukraine that is a rump Ukraine, meaning a Ukraine without the eastern Donbass and without Crimea, is a viable national entity. We're winning that war. The Novorossiya project that Putin was proposing at the beginning of last year, at this time last year, is dead in the water. Ukraine as a country has a future in a national sense. Now, Does it have a future as a viable economic entity? That has to do with the ongoing war with what we call the Hydra. It's got to do with the war on corruption. It's got to do with perhaps making the 50% shadow economy a little bit smaller. It's got to do with a variety of different things where the answer to that question of whether it's open or not, whether we're winning or not, I think is still very much open. Whether the bourgeois dimension of the Maidan is actually going to win, I'm optimistic, but it's going to take a long time. And the third one is the war that I think that many of us as Ukrainians in the West should perhaps, I would encourage you to perhaps try to work towards making politicians in the West understand that the war in Ukraine is in fact actually a peripheral war to Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin has made it very, very clear in all of his public pronouncements, he's not at war in Ukraine. He's at war with NATO, and more specifically with the United States. His goal, and this is where I defer with, or I don't concur with Taras, when he says that his goal is to make a rump Ukraine, etc. His goal is to have a new Yalta, meaning what he's trying to get to is that whoever is president of the United States at the time, be it Obama or where else, is going to sit down with him and is going to divide up the world, perhaps with the Chinese president, perhaps not. They're going to divide the world in their spheres of influence. And everything that is going on in Ukraine is just a tool towards getting to that new Yalta. The next one after Ukraine is going to be perhaps the Baltics. It might be some other country. Let's not forget that in every single war game that the Russian military has played over the last 2 years, it has always ended with a nuclear attack on Warsaw. A nuclear attack on Warsaw, very limited nuclear attack on Warsaw, one bomb. Now the question is, does NATO respond or doesn't it respond? And in my opinion, the most likely scenario is a nuclear attack on a tactical nuclear warhead on Warsaw, and the reaction of the West is, okay, let's sit down and negotiate.
Thank you. If it's okay, go ahead quickly.
Bogdan, that's all you've been telling me quickly.
I know, but I have to do this.
Sure. I find the question by Lubomir very intriguing because he quite correctly sort of identifies this sort of preoccupation in the West regarding constitutionalism and this sort of constitutional vector, which underscores the legitimacy of the future political course for Ukraine. And he argues, is there not another way of thinking about this, not least of which is by sort of focusing on voluntarism in the vortex of struggle as a legitimizing feature for a new political order. But I think that, and he says, and we have to recognize and validate this notion of the extraordinary solidarism that has emanated from as a result of the struggle itself. But let me argue this: I think that solidarity comes from combat. And the struggle, in effect, has created considerable energy amongst those volunteers who have recognized in themselves their own strength. They've recognized in themselves something that they had not seen before. But I would argue, however, that comradeship is a phenomenon in combat that is widely experienced. And I'm not sure that it necessarily is the basis for a political community. War is the birth mother of many nations, but not necessarily a political order that is sustainable. I think in response to this notion that somehow, academics should be more responsive, that they need to be in greater communication with Western military think tanks. But sort of the military strategists in the West understand what's happening in eastern Ukraine. They do understand, for example, the competence and the determination and the tenacity of the Ukrainian soldier in the East, and the volunteer in particular. Bredlov, 2 weeks ago, appeared before a Senate committee and basically made his argument that we need to arm these people because they will fight. But that begs another question, and that is, they will fight, but can they govern? And then that brings us back full square to the initial question. It's only through a constitutional order.
I guess there's a question here with Ihra Broda, and again, I want to remind everyone not to comment, but to get right to the question as soon as you can.
To Dr. Kuzio, you mentioned 20 billion in lost or unaccounted for gold reserves, 90 billion deposited in Western banks. Does anybody know where this money is, and is anybody working on retrieving it? Does anybody know what happened to the first $3 billion that Putin apparently lent to Yanukovych? What happened to that money that Russia from time to time demands repayment of? And a personal question, there's a vicious rumor going around that you're actually writing a book on corruption in Ukraine. Is this just a rumor, or is this book ever going to appear?
It was announced indeed when we introduced him.
Was it? Oh, sorry, I must have been sleeping.
Tarase?
Ihor, obvious the book that you referred to coming out in June, you even get credit in the acknowledgements, so there you go. Get a free copy. It's the book that the University of Toronto Press turned down, cancelled my contract with because of pressure from Akhmetov's lawyers. Canada has terrible libel laws in the same way as Britain does. So if you're going to write about corruption and crime in Ukraine or Russia, you have to write about it in America, or get published in America, not in Canada or Britain. That's the reality, sadly. On the question of investigation of where this money comes from, well, there's two aspects, two answers to this. Firstly, I really don't know to what degree the Ukrainian prosecutor's office is doing this. Mikhailo might have a better idea on the ground, but from where I read, the investigative abilities, even intellectual abilities, of the prosecutor's office are terrible. And often journalists such as Naim and Sergei Leshchenko, Ukrainska Pravda, do a far better job of investigation into the money trail than the Ukrainian prosecutor's office. You have to remember the Ukrainian prosecutor's office was never set up in the Soviet Union. It's still a Soviet structure, overmanned, inefficient, and corrupt. And it has 18,000 people working for it, all in Soviet-style uniforms. When you only have 8,000 people working for the for the Crown Prosecution Service in Britain, which has 20 million more people than Ukraine, it was never set up to do this kind of thing. The Ukrainian prosecutor's office was set up to defend and protect Ukraine's elites, not to implement the rule of law. And Poroshenko's two choices of prosecutor generals have been terrible. So he's made a situation which is bad even worse. So whether they'll find this money is one thing, but the other side to this, which is an interesting angle, is of course the hypocrisy of particularly Western Europe. The EU often tells Ukraine to fight corruption, as does the IMF, whereas individual EU member states financially gain from corruption in Ukraine and Russia. Mm-hmm. I mean, Cyprus is one big washing machine and launderer of Russian and Ukrainian dirty money. And it's a member of the EU. Same with, many, France, Britain, of course, Londongrad, Moscow on the Thames. So the irony is that this money is accepted into Western Europe or offshore zones, controlled by Western Europe, like the Virgin Islands, Belize and elsewhere, and without due diligence. That's why you can't go to the US where there would be due diligence, and then the IMF and EU and World Bank lend money to Ukraine because it's broke. So you have a problem on the question of which I think previous speakers talked about, the issue of how to understand the Maidan. I would put my emphasis would be on justice, private livers, because one major reason why Ukrainians as a whole, from lower income Ukrainians to the top, don't pay their taxes, and they are very bad at paying taxes, probably worse than Italians and Greeks, which is saying a lot. is that they don't see justice. They don't believe the money will go to where it's supposed to go. So you have the senior Ukrainians sending money offshore and bankrupting Ukraine that way, whereas lower-ranking Ukrainians with lower social status don't pay their taxes and work in the shadow economy and such like, and they don't. So therefore the Ukrainian budget is starved from very wealthy people and from lower down people. And the root cause of this is the lack of a contract between the state and the population at large. And that is central, that issue is central to the Orange Revolution and central to the Euromaidan. Just one final point, Mikhailo loves to always have a dig at Yulia Tymoshenko, he's never liked her, that's fine. I agree with everything he actually said. But let's remember that Viktor Yushchenko never once showed his face on the Euromaidan, and that says a lot.
Yep, agreed.
My question is about the need to assess Putin in a more comprehensive way, and that is to take account of the possibility that he's going to engage the West in psychological terrorism, in the sense that he's going to play mind games, and what he's going to try to do is confuse and upset and exasperate, and I don't think the West is at all ready for that. I was at a meeting during International Week here in which the keynote speaker, Gwen Dyer, indicated that all this would blow over in the eastern Ukraine because more or less dismissed Russia as being quite incapable of causing any great amount of being very dangerous. And I look at Obama, he's very complacent and presumptuous and not aware of the potential danger. I don't know whether to call it danger, but more or less a sense of there's a psychological force and determination that is being displayed by Russia, in which it wants to assert itself as being a meaningful actor on the world stage and not to be dismissed as it has been in the past. And I'm just wondering if anybody wants to comment on that.
Bohdan, or
just as we're talking about geopolitics here, and I would refer to a comment made by Angela Merkel some months back, where in effect that she described Mr. Putin as sort of operating in an alternative universe. The rejoinder some weeks ago was that in fact everybody else seems to be working in an alternative universe. That Mr. Putin seems to be knows what he's doing, rather everybody else does not seem to know what they're doing. That being said, however, it seems to me that there are sort of leaders within the EU, and sort of leaders who in effect who have a responsibility to and obligations to NATO, but at the same time understand their own predicament. Lithuanian president, as well as the leadership in Poland and elsewhere, have indicated that this is, and Estonia and Latvia, that these are difficult circumstances, and they've signaled to Washington, London, and elsewhere their anxiety and concern. The United States and as well as their NATO allies have responded accordingly. They've mustered battalions for frontline service, ratcheted up in terms of flights on the borders and so on and so forth. But what it tells me is that this is a very calculated approach to dealing with Mr. Putin. And so we begin to see the sort of a larger kind of strategy at play, of which no one knows what the end game is. So there is a lot of caution, there's a lot of trepidation and the like. But at the end of the day, there is this real sense that Mr. Putin represents a danger. And in the process of trying to understand exactly where the red line might be, there will be a lot of discussion and conversation taking place. So the characterization that it's all in Putin's hands, I'm not sure that is sort of satisfactory kind of characterization. There are people who do understand what's at stake here and are prepared to commit when the time comes.
I will concur with you that the war is with NATO and with the United States, and all the novels that I have read so far, which were published long before this problem erupted, places NATO and the United States on top of the list. The Ukrainians are only their tools. I have a question, and that's because my novels don't give me that answer. A question about the Crimean Tatars. Is there any discussion in the Ukrainian government or the Ukrainians and the Europeans what can be done in order to protect and help the Crimean Tatars? I don't see Turkey engaged in any of these discussions. The second very quick question, and that's because in addition to not having military experts, we have not had psychologists. What is the impact of the situation right now on the population in Ukraine? I have read recently that there is mass hysteria up to a certain extent. So I want to know how this is being addressed.
Which panelist would like to respond?
Pani Natalia was looking directly at me in that whole question, so I think I should probably respond to that. I'm assuming that that was in my direction. Sorry, Taras, if that's okay with you. The issue of the Crimean Tatars, the reality is, the sad reality is, that Ukraine has so many problems at the moment internally with its own, with fighting a war, with fighting against what we call the Hydra, with trying to make the West understand that it's not just Ukraine's war, but it's also a global war, that unfortunately, the issue of the Crimean Tatars has been largely sidelined. Now, every single newscast that I watch, I usually watch 2 newscasts a day. I watch TSN, which is 1+1, and then I watch STB, because I get a balanced, 2 different owners of news channels, which is always a good thing. And then I mostly get my news from the internet and from personal contacts. But every single news channel, every single newscast, every night will have a story about Crimean Tatars. And that has started, I would say, from the new year. In other words, the last 3 months. The issue of the Tatars is being brought up as a political issue. Now, it's normally 20 minutes into the newscast, because there will be other things that will be much more important, but there will be something that will be mentioned. If that's any kind of an indicator of the answer to your question. Is there anything specifically being done? There's very little that Ukraine can do. The Russian Federation has annexed Crimea. They recognize it as being their territory. The Crimean Tatars are being. It's a very sad story because their offices are being their various Majlis, etc. offices are being searched regularly. We've got issues of people disappearing. We've got issues of, in other words, activists disappearing. We've got issues of violence against them. But unfortunately, there's really very little that Ukraine can do. I think that we should realize, I'm not sure that everybody in the audience understands what the border between Ukraine and Crimea looks like at the moment. There is no train service. There is no bus service. There is no car service, meaning you cannot drive your car across the border unless you have Crimean license plates. If you do not have Crimean license plates, you leave your car at the border, you walk across, and there will be buses that will take you to the nearest town from the other side, and they will charge you an arm and a leg for that, right? So there's really very little contact across that administrative border. That is the reality. So Crimea has been cut off from Ukraine proper. And that also causes problems with supplying Crimea. Crimea at the moment has massive problems in terms of food supplies, elementary things. I think many of you probably know about that. One very, very short comment. Trying to guess what is in Putin's head is a really thankless task. Unless we've got psychotherapists in the room, I suggest we stop trying to do that. He's a master at trying to fool everybody around. I think the idea of terrorism, as you were saying, and trying to keep people off guard in the West is probably a realistic strategy. But whether or not he's going to use it tomorrow or whether or not he's going to use it last year. Any of you that read my stuff last year used to know that I used to panic a lot. I panic a lot less, right? Because I've learned to stop trying to predict Putin. Understanding scenarios is a good idea. Trying to predict the viability of those scenarios is really, really very much a thankless task. And your last question was on mass hysteria. You know, I think that Ukrainians have a lot to be proud of. I met a fellow who was a Turkish activist, and then he came to Ukraine with right after the Turkish, I guess, revolution you would call it, and he was there with an Egyptian, and this was a sort of a round table about Tahrir and about the various things that have happened, and they both were absolutely amazed that when Mejhiria was opened up on February 23rd, nobody stormed it. Nobody stole anything. We just opened up and Ukrainians walked in and were in awe and walked around and sort of looked at things and said how bad it was that Yanukovych had stolen so much. In the Arab world, that would have been stormed. They would have stolen everything and it would have been destroyed within 12 hours. Ukrainians have some sort of or at least that's what they said. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to make slurs at the Arab world. I'm quoting Egyptians and the Turks. I think that we have a lot to be proud of in terms of the terpimist. Help me with that. Patience, I guess, yeah, of Ukrainians. You know, Ukrainians are very, very patient with a lot of problems, and then once they blow, they really blow. I'm going back to if you like, the Cossack history for that. I don't really see hysteria at the moment at all. I see a lot of people that are very unhappy with the way things are going. But we're far from a third Maidan, and we're very far from any kind of hysteria that might be dangerous to the current political elite.
Okay, I think we're...
Bogdan, can I say something on this?
Go ahead, 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, quickly. One has to remember that Crimean Tatars themselves, I don't think they expect that much because they've gone through, if you look at the last three, not Poroshenko, but the previous 3 Ukrainian presidents, of the 3, the best in terms of supporting the Crimean Tatars, ironically, was Kuchma.
Mm-hmm.
Yushchenko was his usual lazy self, never did anything for the Crimean Tatars, this is a fact. And of course there was outright xenophobic hostility from Yanukovych and his local minions like the Crimean Prime Minister Mohylyov. And remember the party regions like the communists and Crimean Russian nationalists uphold the Russian view that the Crimean Tatars collaborated with the Nazis and therefore it was right for Stalin to deport them. So the best of Ukraine's presidents was ironically Kuchma for the Crimean Tatars. You also have a different situation in Turkey. You have Islamicists in power who tend to be more willing to do deals with Russia, whereas in the 90s it was a different situation when Kuchma was president, because then you had Ataturk, pro-Ataturk Turkish political parties, and they were far more active in supporting Crimean Tatars and more anti-Russian. Just on the question, just quickly to finish on the question of the military, and somebody asked about the volunteer battalions. Well, but let's remember that sadly a lot of the Western press focuses on only one of the volunteer battalions, the Azov battalion, because they have the stupid swastika flag, and that leads to a stereotype that they're all a bunch of Nazis in these volunteer battalions. You know, they can tell us that this is not a Nazi symbol, but the way it's portrayed in the Western media, that this is a Nazi battalion, and that's sadly a fact. But on the question of Poroshenko's attitudes, I think that he follows the same practices he follows vis-a-vis other appointments he makes, such as in the prosecutor's office. Poroshenko's over-reliant on senior Soviet-style generals and officials. I mean, we're on the 4th Ministry of Defense since the Euromaidan. And these Soviet generals are pretty useless in this kind of combat, which is counterinsurgency warfare. And hence, Ukraine's lost a lot of soldiers and volunteers at the three major battles, Ilovaisk last August, Donetsk airport in January, and now Debaltseve in February. And those were pretty degrading moments where Ukrainians were actually in a meat grinder, and a lot of young people were killed. And a lot of that was down to very bad use of these old-style Soviet generals that unfortunately Poroshenko still looks to. And coupled with that is the lack of any use of helicopter power. I mean, Ukrainians could kill a lot of separatists and Russian forces if they used helicopters, but they don't use air power against these separatists, which is very unusual in counterinsurgency warfare. And they overuse artillery, which leads to civilian deaths, sadly. I mean, you can't, you're not going to create conditions for a political solution in Donbass by firing artillery shells at regions in the Donbass. Thank you.